Risk management professionals provide these ongoing webinars to provide information to our clients in the general community. Anyone who's interested is welcome to sign up for free. We specialize in the EPA RMP or risk management plans, the OSHA, PSM, and CalARP programs. We also do a lot of work with the HAZOP and LOPA facilitation and studies, and any other safety regulations that may be out there. We're typically got our hand in everything. We can assist many different kinds of clients, and we definitely have the expertise to help anyone in need. So feel free to give us a call if you ever have any questions about the webinar or anything else. We're happy to help. Our main objective is to share information and make sure everyone's aware of what's going on, and to provide this information in a useful manner and make sure that everyone has access to it. We will be recording this webinar today. This will be available within the next week, and an email will be sent out to the sign-ups for today's webinar when that is posted. It'll also be available through our website and the webinars page. So as I stated before, we'll be talking about the emergency response plans versus emergency action plans for ammonia facilities. The presentation will cover a brief regulatory background, the difference between an ERP and EAP, the requirements for each ERP and EAP, a general review of what to look for if you are the supervisor or person in charge of reviewing the document and what should be included, and some general conclusions. The objective today is to provide knowledge for the differences between the two programs. Again, a brief overview of the regulatory requirements for both programs, to help everyone understand the applications and implementation of each plan and what makes them different, and provide the ability to review the ERP or EAP effectively for functional use and for compliance. So brief regulatory background. We have these local emergency response planning programs on the left-hand side, the Area Operations Plan, Disaster General Plan, and Hazard Mitigation Plan. They're usually run on a city or county level. There are also the Hazard Material Facility Response Planning programs, and there's a pretty lengthy list there, but essentially it's everything a facility may need to have emergency or hazard material response. And the Hazard Materials Area Plan kind of covers and bridges the gap between the two. Some observations from major incidents are a lack of communication, and this can occur either prior to an event with planning, training, and preparation, or during the event if there's ineffective communication while the emergency is happening. An incident could result from the inability to execute the emergency response plan. Again, going back to training and preparation, if those aren't effective with the team that's responding, they will not be effective in practice. Inadequate procedures and or training. Again, we go back to preparing for an emergency, make sure everyone knows what their job responsibilities are. Lack of proper equipment, so to ensure that all proper PPE or other response equipment is available to the teams. Any kind of out-of-date contact information, which I've seen a lot, to ensure that all contact information is updated to the current job responsibilities and emergency contacts. And this includes 24-hour numbers for those top contacts that need to be available at all times. And a lack of coordination with the emergency response ground teams. So local fire department hazmat team. This was brought into the new CalARP regulations that were proclamated on January 1st of this year. Those are in effect right now, so it's important to remember to coordinate with your local teams, with your local fire department, and make sure that they are aware of what you have at your facility and how to respond, and that's even more important. There are some planning requirements. As you can see, this is a lengthy list. It may not be applicable to every facility, but I'd like to provide this list of other requirements that come into play with emergency response. It may be that information will be coming from the PSM program, an oil pollution prevention program, and HAZWOPER may come into play. And so it's important to realize that just because it's not in the ERP or EAP requirements in the regulation itself that there are these other regulations and requirements that may apply. So what's the difference between an ERP and an EAP? Most importantly, the ERP is provided for, or is geared towards facilities taking offensive actions during an emergency. Any kind of response would include entering hazardous atmosphere, where you could potentially need respirators and further training on respirator use, or any other area to shut down the system, or to rescue someone else. And so it's important to note that just because you may not be responding to a fire or going into stop the leak, it still may be classified as a response. Response actions are needed for protection of life or prevention of significant damage to the property or to the community. So it's important to note that, and there is a very fine line between response and non-response. We'll talk about that a little bit more this morning. The EAP is applicable to facilities that are non-responding or only defensive actions. That's essentially evacuating and calling 911 or your local hazmat team. There's not much else that's qualified as non-responding, except if you can remotely hit an emergency stop button on the system, whether it be as you're evacuating, there's an e-stop on the egress out, or if it can be done by cell phone or remote or radio somehow. That's pretty much the only kind of response that you can perform that would be considered a non-responding facility or more of a defensive action. And it's really important to note the differences. They are very fine differences, but it's very important to know what those are. So again, essentially, employees will evacuate, and there will be a person or persons responsible for the evacuation and those procedures. First responders are the people who will respond to the release with the intention of stopping and containing the hazardous materials from the environment and community. They will report to local authority as soon as possible, but they are the first people on site and will be the first people to respond to an emergency. First responders maintain the ERP. They should be trained, properly trained, and have procedures in place on what to do and what equipment they need, et cetera, et cetera. And with the adequate training should come preparation drills. If they do need to coordinate with local agencies, since the local authority will probably come in at some point to either take over or do some follow-up, it's still important to coordinate with local authorities, even if your facility is a first responding facility. For non-first responders, the plan is to evacuate. There are still established documentation and evacuation procedures in place, and personnel that are responsible for those evacuations and notifications. The local authority will basically have jurisdiction to respond. So this will be, we evacuate, we get everyone out of the building or off the property, we call 911, and 911 will handle it. Fire department and hazmat teams will handle it. This will maintain an EAP and provide the information to support emergency responders. So you will still have contact lists, general procedures for some things, but it won't be as robust as an ERP since you're non-responding. So an ERP versus an EAP, the primary objective is to optimize the protection for personnel, the community, and the environment. It's important to take in certain variables like what personnel may be available and if there's a municipal emergency responder nearby. And the facility characteristics. What kind of resources do you have at the facility? Is it a large facility or something manned by 2 people that may not be able to respond? Is it manned 24 hours? Is there a fire department nearby that can respond and maybe have faster response time with greater training where they can be responsible for an incident with your assistance? So there's a balance between getting all parties involved, and there's usually an optimal response coordination that can happen. And it's just really important to remember that responsibilities are outlined, procedures are in place, contact numbers, and any other pertinent information if PPE is needed, all of that is in place before an emergency happens. It's all about preparation and training. So an application for an ERP, for example, would be a facility in a remote location or an organization that does not have a local fire department or hazmat team available to them for effective response. We can, for sake of having a good example, it could be an agricultural facility or maybe a refrigeration facility out in the middle of the desert somewhere, or out, outside of a major city where the fire department would not be able to respond quickly. The facility may be likely to maintain a basic ERP with some personnel trained to handle maybe smaller incidences that are more manageable by a non-emergency responder when you think of municipal responders like the fire department hazmat team. They will still need to be trained appropriately. Emergency response team will have to be ready and on call 24/7. And it will be important to keep the ERP updated and the personnel trained. For an EAP, maybe would be more appropriate in a heavily populated area where there is a local fire department or hazmat personnel available. Maybe the facility's down the street from a fire department. You've talked with the fire chief, everyone knows what's going on, and you don't necessarily need to have responders on site. An EAP would be appropriate. And again, that would be coordinating with the facility and the emergency responders or the local agencies with walkthroughs, drills, exercises, and reviewing procedures together, especially call-out lists and things. Who gets called, in what order, what are the phone numbers, updating it all, every year, or when there are changes, and we'll talk more about when to update things later. Discussing what the emergency responders are capable of in the area. Do they know the hazards of ammonia? Do they know the hazards of any other chemicals that may come into play that are on the facility? It's really important that these first responders, and that be internal or external first responders, know the hazards of the chemicals that they're working with. And this also goes into general employee notification as well. Training and signage, any kind of emergency shutdown procedures, that all needs to be in writing and also trained to the emergency responders that will be on site. So where the ERP requirements come from? They're all listed in Title 29 of the CFR in 1910.120 Section Q. And we'll go through those. The ERP requirements call out pre-emergency planning and coordination, personnel roles, training and communication, and lines of authority, how to recognize an emergency and to prevent an emergency from happening, where are the safe distances, places of refuge at the facility or just off the facility, and what kind of site security does the facility have, where are the evacuation routes, and what are the procedures for evacuation. Is there any kind of decontamination that needs to happen if someone's exposed? How does that happen? Any kind of emergency medical treatment. Who's qualified to provide first aid? What training is provided? Where are the training certificates located? Any kind of emergency alerts or response procedures. Who's going to do the call-outs? Who's responsible for calling the fire department when it gets out of hand, or to follow up after the fact? Who's going to critique the responses? Do you have someone ready and available to evaluate whether or not the response was adequate and whether or not the drills are adequate? And any kind of PPE, who's going to keep track of that? Who's going to ensure that the correct PPE is available to those emergency responders? This could include additional HAZWOPER training and medical surveillance, and respirator fitting, things like that. That all needs to be coordinated in the ERP and at least called out and referenced in the ERP and done and completed. The emergency response structure should follow the National Incident Management System, NIMS. And NIMS is basically a command system for communication down the line. It establishes responsibilities and integrates into up the line basically to a state or federal response. So it keeps everything coordinated. It maintains a structure for communication that can be carried up the line should the response or the incident get much bigger than expected. And this is a slide for the ICS structure. You have an Emergency Operations Center Director with the Operations section organizing and directing field activities. The Planning and Intelligence section evaluating and prioritizing risks associated with the response and the distribution of the information that is necessary. The logistics section will provide resources and services to support the operations during an emergency, and more on a municipal level, but the finance administration section will take care of claims, resolve contractual issues, and tracking any kind of financial aspect of the response. The ICS has some key features. There's some common terminology, and again, this is all to coordinate up the line, so from the facility level all the way up to a federal level of communication, to keep everyone on the same page and to make sure everyone understands one system to communicate. So there is common terminology to be used and an organizational structure for everyone, even if it's not applicable in some cases. Like I said, the administrative and finance section may only be at a municipal level. It's important to be aware of all that. There are consistent position titles, so everyone knows and understands the positions in play. Integrated communications, that's unified across the board. Common incident facilities and where this will all be commanded from, like a command center. There's module organization and a command structure that work together and are uniform. There are action plans that are pretty standard across the board, and again, this is to keep everyone on the same page during an emergency and to be able to carry it up the line. There's a span of control associated with who's responsible and what kind of agency should get involved and when, and then resource management and scalability to it. Typically, the ERP will have the most critical information on the front cover. It's important to remember that this needs to be used during an emergency. There's an emergency action guide that's usually a shortcut guide on what there is to do. There's a section for key personnel emergency phone numbers, and again, that can also be put on the critical information on the front cover. There's the incident organizational structure, which takes you into NIMS and ICS, and there's separate trainings on those through FEMA as well. General location information, where the facility is located, what kind of resources are in the area, any kind of maps or site plans that are needed to respond or to know where things are. First aid procedures for key chemicals, just general procedures are usually applied, and response action. Then there's usually supporting information behind the main report. These are usually in appendixes. And this will contain maybe additional contact information, maybe a longer list of people that need to be notified if the emergency gets larger or after the fact, after the main contacts are called and informed. If there are any forms or an overview or position descriptions for the ICS structure, shutdown procedures or alarms that may indicate where there's an issue, locations of the chemicals, if there's more description other than a basic map. And if there's any other engineering data or public relations, if there's a script that should be used for public relations or other supporting documentation, that should all really be in the back of the ERP. And it's more for, okay, we got the initial response going, we're starting, now we got to kind of do the follow-up. Where are those forms I need? Hey, the press is calling. We need to get that script together so that we know what we're going to say about this. And that's all very important information to have, but not necessarily in the midst of the beginnings of an emergency. Training is actually called out pretty explicitly in the regulation. There are several levels of first responders that need to be trained specifically. These trainings should be conducted by a certified instructor, and they have to be approved through a certification process. You can't just do these, perform these trainings or attend these trainings by just anyone, and it's important to note that. There's a first responder awareness training. And this is basically, the person is trained at a level to initiate emergency response. They know who to notify, what an emergency looks like, if there's an incident, a spill or whatnot. They're able to make the call on whether or not this is a small spill that can be handled internally and it's not really an emergency response, but more of just a spill cleanup, or if this is a major incident ready to happen or already happening. And they need to be trained and ready to make that call on the spot. It's a very pretty basic training. I think it's an 8-hour training of just an awareness level. The first responder operations level are trained to take a defensive action without stopping the release. So if they can contain a spill to keep it from going farther, keep a liquid spill from spreading, or maybe shut a locked door to keep vapor inside a room and prevent exposures, that's their responder level. And that requires 8 hours of training that will include basic hazards, proper PPE to put on, and standard operating procedures. Then there's the hazard materials technician. Then these people are trained to respond to a release with the intention of stopping the release. This is a 24-hour training, 8 of which are equivalent to the FRO training from the operations level. The hazard materials specialist is to provide support to the hazmat technician. They are trained as a liaison to any kind of municipal agency or government authority that could come in and help or potentially need more information. And they have the same 24 hours of training that the hazmat technician has, but they just carry a different role and responsibility. And there's the unseen incident commander. They assume control after the first responding awareness level trained person witnesses that there's an issue. That's the first person they go to, is the incident commander. This is the person who will be in charge, have ultimate responsibility over response in the emergency. They have 24 hours of training equal to the first responder operations level. And they also should go through the training for the ICS and ERP implementation. ICS and NIMS, again, are available through the FEMA website, and they have lots of levels of training and different variations depending on how explicit and how responsible a facility wants to be as far as having an incident commander, how authoritative they want to be about that. And that kind of goes into the last bullet there with the ICS training. There are also tabletop drills and exercises that should be done by anyone at the facility. If you have an ERP in place, everyone should understand and participate and observe drills and exercises, tabletop exercises, physical evacuations and exercises to perhaps stop a leak or something like that, and make sure the emergency responders nearby are involved. Even if a facility has an ERP, the local responders, the fire department, hazmat teams, whoever may potentially respond from a 911 call should also be invited to these. It is important to keep these local authorities informed in case it progresses into something the facility can't handle. And that's really important to note. As far as equipment goes for emergency response, it could be anything from fire extinguishers and spill kits to proper PPE. Again, we get into the potential for respirators, SCBAs, or encapsulated suits, depending on the chemical and the type of response that's going to be initiated. Communication. Radios are really important. Don't want to use cell phones. You never know if they're going to be reliable or not. The radios that are charged at the ready and in one spot are usually very useful. Emergency alarm systems, are there any on the facility? Should they be added to the facility to help with an emergency and response? And any kind of safety systems, deluge systems, emergency shutdowns that are automatic, scrubber systems, any of this that may be useful to prevent an emergency or help during an emergency. And with all this comes testing and calibration of the equipment, and that's important to note as well. Those will have to go in the procedures. And with that, we move on to the emergency action plan requirements that are called out in 29 CFR 1910.38A. And these are much lighter. As we go through them, you'll see there's a lot less documentation because of the non-responding nature of the facility. The EAP requires the identity to identify the designated actions of employers and employees, what they need to do to maintain safety from fire or other emergencies. Again, this goes into a non-responding facility, so it's an action that you could take without actually falling into that response category. And it's a very fine line, but it's very important to note. Specific requirements of the EAP are to have an emergency evacuation procedure and route assignments. Knowing what's upwind and uphill versus maybe potentially downwind, wind roses and windsock in the area are very helpful for this. There should always be maps included within the plan, and then also I always recommend around the plant site, whether it be posted on emergency exit wall or available multiple locations to grab on your way out the door. The map should contain routes, windsock locations, and meeting area locations. And again, everyone should be trained in this as well, everyone at the facility. The procedures should have a method to account for all employees during an evacuation, There should be someone responsible, or maybe multiple people responsible for taking a head count when everyone gets to the meeting location, making sure everyone's accounted for. There should be procedures for employees who perform rescue or medical duties. This would fall into CPR, first aid. If they have any medical training, to notate that, who's qualified, who's been trained, who knows where the equipment is, marking where the first aid kit is on the map, or notifying people during training. Essentially, these people should not become part of the problem. They should be helping. So it's important, again, it's important to come back to training and procedures and exercises, that all this needs to be happening. There should be names and job titles of the people or departments that can be contacted for information. This includes 24-hour numbers. So again, maintaining documentation with updated contacts and contact information. And there should be an employee alarm system. How is everyone notified there's an emergency happening at the facility? Is there a visual audio alarm? Does someone walk around notifying everyone? How do you account for people that may be, outside and may not hear an alarm that's inside a building? Things like that need to be accounted for and need to be specified within the plan. And again, coming back to training, everyone needs to be trained. Evacuation drills, bringing in the local fire department to help with some of that in response. This all comes into preparation and training and making sure everyone knows what they're doing during an emergency. So when you're reviewing your ERP or EAP, it's important to note that employee responsibilities and emergency contact points are clearly delineated. Again, we go back to putting the most important information on the front cover. That way it's right out in the middle of where you're looking, and it's very easy to find an emergency. Also, that all information is current. This is especially important if you have a high turnover at a facility, keep the plan simple so that it can be updated realistically and easily. And this goes into modularizing the plan to facilitate updating. Maybe you put all the contact lists or all the contact numbers on 1 or 2 pages at the front. And that way, if anyone leaves or you need to update phone numbers, you just have to replace the 2 pages rather than trying to find those 2 pages within a 20-page section of the report. And that also comes into usability, that you want to make this easy to use. You have to assume, even if everyone's trained, that someone will panic and not know exactly what they need to do and how to make it as easy as possible to use this material or the plans during an emergency. Knowing the evacuation and the employee accountability plan, knowing who's responsible and outlining that explicitly in the report is very important, that those people are trained and can handle that kind of responsibility to make sure everyone can evacuate appropriately. And reference non-critical information. There shouldn't be a lot of fluff. This should be very straightforward, to the point. These plans should be designed, to work in an emergency. If you have a lot of documentation to go through to find what you're looking for, it's probably not effective. And that's really important to remember and keep in mind. And the organizational structure for the response, having that outlined structure, who's going to be responsible as the incident commander, who's going to be underneath them, helping managing some of the other activities, who's responsible for evacuation, who's responsible for calling the fire department. All that's really important to make sure is delineated and notated very clearly in the report. For updates and certification, basically when the plan's initially developed, it should be certified and checked by multiple people, make sure everything's put together and all the information is there. When employees' responsibilities change, or when their plan is changed, say contact numbers change, it should all be updated and recertified. And by certified, basically mean a certification page in the front, or maybe an appendix saying, yes, I reviewed it, here's my signature, here's the date I reviewed it. It can be a very simple page that can just be kept over the years and added to very easily, but it's a record that someone looked at it, and when there were updates, they verified that all the information that was necessary was still there. Again, for best practice, there should be an annual review, update, or certification more often if you have more turnover or if a change occurs at the facility. When new phone numbers change or key personnel change, maybe your incident commander leaves to go to another facility, or maybe they get bumped up to corporate and they're no longer at the facility. That's when these changes need to occur, and when new certifications and reviews need to happen. or if there's a key asset characteristic that changes. So if there's a change in design or operations at the facility that would indicate a change to emergency response, it's really important to make sure you review all the documentation. And for the Program 3 facilities out there, it probably means you should be looking at this when you have an MOC and PSSR going on. Just a verification that as you're making changes to equipment or to the facility that you're not introducing more hazards that could change the emergency response to the facility. And for the Program 1 and Program 2 facilities, it's just a good idea whenever you make changes to just go ahead and check it. It doesn't hurt to spend a few extra minutes so that if there is an emergency, you're prepared and ready to go. So in conclusion, it's important that each facility validate the best ERP or EAP option and balancing the municipal resources in the area, the responsibility the facility wishes to have, protect personnel, community, and the environment, and the cost to upkeep the program. This can be costly to train people. It requires a lot of time and effort at the very beginning when you initiate this. It could be a resource issue at the facility. Again, maybe your facility has 2 people on site because maintaining the facility with 24 hours, and you may have a larger crew and another time period, maybe normal daylight hours. It's important to know those resources and what your capabilities are, and not building, say, emergency response plan for a facility that just doesn't have the personnel to be able to do that. And to keep the training and emergency drills going. It's really important to do those at least once a year. And again, if you don't have the resources or the funds to do that, it may be better to look at other options for emergency response. And with that, I'll take any questions that anyone has through the feed.
So our first question, do you need an ERP and an EAP, or you pick the one that is applicable to your facility?
You want to pick, well, the question was, do you need both? Do you need an ERP or an EAP, or is it just one or the other? And the answer is it's just one or the other. And this comes into play for what kind of responsibility the facility wants. There are legal and I guess community responsibilities to having an ERP. There's more expected from a facility who has an emergency response plan and people trained and ready to respond versus an action plan where you're relying on the fire department to have the emergency response resources available. And that goes into some of the conclusion and the comparison between the two. That it really depends on where the facility is located and what kind of resources are available, and what kind of liability or responsibility that a facility wants.
Question, is medical information in an SDS sufficient for EAP requirements, or is more medical information expected?
The question was, is medical information and a safety data sheet adequate for an EAP? If by medical information you mean like a medical surveillance or basic physical that maybe is required by the facility for employees working around certain chemicals or performing certain job duties, that should be more than adequate. I believe, and this is where I may have to look something up, if you want to follow up with me afterwards, that's fine. My email's on the slide shown. But I believe it's required that every facility now or every company by the OSHA laws is required to have at least one person first aid and CPR trained. I mean, I may be wrong on that, and I can double check that if someone wants to get back to me via email. But that would qualify for the EAP. As far as having someone, with basic medical training to be able to respond and help in an evacuation where maybe someone trips and sprains an ankle or something like that. As far as the safety data sheet, that should always be included. That's always helpful in an emergency to have that information available. I don't know if it's explicitly called out as a requirement, but it's definitely a plus.
Next question, what is important for the ERP documentation?
When we recap some of the slides I used earlier, but it's really important to keep the ERP documentation or EAP documentation straightforward. Not including a lot of extra information, only having information that is needed during an emergency response, and putting a priority on that information. Again, going back to phone numbers on the front cover so there's no confusion on who to call first, and listing them in the order that they should be called in. Things like that are very easy to do up front and make responding to emergency and doing drills appropriately and effectively much easier.
What are effective ways to communicate the emergency plans, either ERP or EAP, to a facility's employees?
The question was about communicating the information from ERPs and or EAPs to the facility employees. More often than not, effective communication is going to cover a lot of different types of communication. You could go into oral presentations, a physical walk down of the facility, emergency drills, possibly even just the written program. So, everyone learns differently, everyone retains the information differently. So it's important to have all these resources available and provide them to people depending on how they learn and how they can absorb the information. Most cases practice makes perfect, and to have frequent drills and consistent drills with everyone present is usually the most effective way.
And next question, as an employee, how do I ensure I have the proper PPE available to me?
The question was, how do you ensure that the PPE is available as an employee? And the answer is just to bring it up to the person responsible for providing PPE. That is every company's responsibility to ensure that their employees have the PPE available to them to keep them safe for the job duties they have. And this includes the emergency response as well as general facility duties.
And last question, can you explain the incident command structure a little more?
The incident command structure, again, is designed to bring together communications from a very local level, being the facility level, all the way up to a federal level consistently. So if you're talking about a facility incident that maybe carries up to a county or even a state level, that incident command system or the structure on how the communications are happening and how the incident is being handled will be standardized for everyone to be able to use. That's why it brings in standard language, standard responsibility titles, things like that to help carry the information up to the top of wherever the highest responsibility will land, and to keep everyone standardized. There's a lot of information on FEMA. There are a lot of additional trainings that are available through FEMA, and they're offered, I believe they may be offered online now, I don't remember, but I do know they're offered throughout the country, and they tend to be a little pricey, but if you are looking to have a facility with an ERP in place, it's definitely important to have at least one person, maybe a few people trained in the ICS structure, how it works, and how, across the board from top to bottom. And do we have any more questions?
That's it for questions.
All right, well then that will conclude our webinar. If you have any further questions, my email is on the presentation, or you can catch us through our website. I hope everyone has a good day.